Great, thanks, Chris. Let me start off by apologizing for my looks. This is what happens when you're trying to do too many things on a bicycle, too many things but thinking. This is a real honor to be on the panel with Ms. Mpetwa. As Roseanne introduced, Zimbabwe is a place I've done a fair bit of research in over the years. I'm just going to give a very kind of broad discussion of the early part of this road. I think we're going to wait for Beatrice to talk about where the road is potentially going in Zimbabwe. So I'm going to just kind of hit the highlights or the lowlights of some issues in the Zimbabwean history to try to help put into context where we are now with this what's called the Global Political Agreement and the unity government between the ZANU-PF and MDC. Let me start off by briefly talking about the fact that Zimbabwe was a colony. It used to be called Southern Rhodesia, and like its neighbor to the south, apartheid South Africa, it was a highly racially segregated by law, where if those who are classified as Europeans had more rights and possibilities and freedoms than those classified as Africans, including rights to organize and rights to property. And generally, African farmers were shunted off to poor lands. When different African leaders in the colony tried to demand and call for more rights to Africans, they were met with batons and put in jail and imprisoned. Eventually, this generated a liberation struggle, national liberation struggle, starting in the 1960s, but really picking up with great pace in the 1970s. It led to a very bitter civil war, particularly carried out in the rural areas of Zimbabwe, where the majority of people live, where terror was inflicted by all sides, but particularly the hardest coming from the white minority Rhodesian Front regime. Led to a negotiated settlement. The negotiations in 1979 led to independence in 1980, with all Zimbabweans having the right to vote. And the former guerrilla armies and their political wings became political parties, and one of those guerrilla armies' political wings, called ZANU-PF, under a relatively recent leadership of one Robert Mugabe, won the election in 1980. And has ruled and challenged, at least politically, since February of this year. So for 28 years, ZANU-PF has controlled the levers of power in the state of Zimbabwe, and some argue they may still control those levers. This is stuff we'll be talking about. Under ZANU-PF rule, there's definitely some benefits. The education system, the government built many more schools and clinics. Zimbabwe had one of the best educated populations in Africa until recently. They had a higher living standards. They continued the diversified economy which the Rhodesians built, so it had one of the more robust economies in sub-Saharan Africa. And Mugabe himself became a renowned international statesman, particularly in what was known as the frontline states, the states which were mobilizing against the apartheid regime in South Africa, but also in arenas like the Commonwealth. But of course, as everyone knows quite clearly now, not all was rosy under ZANU-PF rule. And particularly what I want to highlight here, that the intolerance of political opposition, intolerance of open criticism, intolerance of at times, freedom of association. And it hasn't all happened in the last 9 years. The kind of the defining moment, at least particularly retrospectively, is what happened in the southern and western part of the country, in the provinces of Matabeleland, North and South and Midlands provinces. In both 1982 to 1987, the state unleashed a division of the army, as well as the police and the secret police, the CIO, to root out what they viewed as dissidents, what they claimed to be supported by the apartheid regime. What it really meant was that it became a form of ethnic cleansing. It was a way to stomp out the then opposition political party of ZAPU, headed by Joshua Nkomo, which had been the other main guerrilla army during the liberation struggle. There hasn't been a real thorough public investigation what happened in those 5-6 years, but a lot of terror was unleashed, lots of people were killed, thousands of people were killed and disappeared, numbers floated up to 20,000. Until finally the then opposition party folded itself into the ruling party, and Joshua Nkomo joined Robert Mugabe as the vice president. But even as that was going on in Zimbabwe, the outside world didn't do too much, to be honest. They still saw Mugabe as a statesman and an ally in kind of the struggle against apartheid and in African development. Let me kind of fast track now to 1999, which was, in retrospect, a very exciting year in Zimbabwe. It was a year of constitutional debate. There was going to be a reform of the constitution. So lots of people were openly discussing what the new constitution should be looking like. There were criticisms of the ZANU-PF regime without any major retributions or recriminations against people. And a new political party was formed in September that year called the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, led by one Morgan Tsvangirai, who had been the head of the National Congress of Trade Unions. It had been a leader kind of kind of advocating for social change and democratic reform throughout the decade of the 90s. The constitution, draft constitution, was tinkered with quite drastically by the executive, by Mugabe, changing what people said what the Constitutional Commission wanted. So the new political party, the MDC, along with a lot of activists and civic groups, mobilized to tell people to vote against the Constitution in the referendum in February 2000, and indeed the referendum shot down the draft constitution. This is the first time ZANU-PF lost a national election, and they had parliamentary elections coming in a few months after that. And Mugabe made a very noble speech the day after the day of when the results came out, saying, "I accept the results, the will of the people," and so forth. And within a few days after that, members of initially war veterans, people ex-combatants who had fought in the Liberation War, started to occupy commercial farms, which are still owned predominantly by white Zimbabweans. Land reform is something we can talk about after if you want, and demanding we want land reform now. Those few land invasions quickly blossomed to over 1,000 farms are being invaded, demanding land reform, and by March, by the following month, the demand for land quickly became entangled with the upcoming political contest between ZANU-PF and MDC for the parliamentary elections going to be held in June that year. And terror started to get unleashed on the farms initially, a bit against the white farmers, a lot against the black farm workers, as well as terror started to grow into the other parts of the rural Zimbabwe, as well as into the townships and so forth. So by the time the election rolled around, even though the Morgan Tsvangirai's party of MDC won almost the same number of seats as ZANU-PF, a lot of people alleged that the election wasn't fair given the use of the state resources to terrorize the population, as well as there's allegations of rigging and so forth. Nonetheless, the results stood. And this has been the result since, has continued for every electoral contest, down to local government elections, to presidential elections, to parliamentary elections. It had occurred in previous elections, but this was the first time Mugabe, probably since 1980, faced an opposition party, had a significant electoral popularity in the national level. So let me now, because I only have about a minute left probably, fast track to 2008, March. They had a parliamentary and presidential election last year in March. And again, long delay of terror going up there, long delay to actually release the results. But the results showed that the MDC Tsvangirai, because there's now two MDC parties, but the bigger one is still led by Morgan Tsvangirai, won the election in terms of it won in terms of the most number of seats, and when you combine with the other MDC. But moreover, Tsvangirai himself won more votes than Mugabe, but because he didn't get 50%, which the Constitution declares you need 50% plus one, they had to have a presidential runoff. from the end of March until the date of that presidential runoff, which was end of June, was the terror just got ramped up dramatically as the ruling party and its supporters recognized they were going to lose the election. So lots of terror, lots of sexual violence, lots of killings. So much so that Morgan Tsvangirai finally said, why am I even running in this? This isn't free and fair, and pulled out. This led to eventually growing mediation by the region, and eventually led to what's called the global political agreement between the three political parties, Tsvangirai's MDC, Mutambara's MDC, and Mugabe's ZANU-PF. The question where we are now is, and that was in September, terror continued until, well, has it continued to the same extent today? The new government of national unity came into power in February this year, and this we can just hear more about from Beatrice. Thank you.
Okay, if I could turn to Jeff now, who's going to talk a little bit about press freedom and journalism, but use Rwanda rather than Zimbabwe, as he's just back from about 5 or 6 weeks there.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. First off, I should say how honored I am to be sharing a stage here with Beatrice. Those of you who heard her speech this morning, I'm sure were inspired by her words about her motive is to make a difference, and that lawyers working within a legal system can make a difference in the lives of individuals. In fact, journalists feel the same way. So your message had a particular resonance for me, and I suspect for the journalism students in the audience. And we also share something else, which is a love of, I read in the Ottawa Citizen this morning, you love Motown and rhythm and blues. So sometime later we'll go dancing. Anyway, as Chris had mentioned, I'm just back from Rwanda. I returned just a few days ago after teaching journalism night school courses for the National University in their extension program in Kigali. I was working with a group of professional journalists who had been in the business for a while. They have an obligation now under a new press freedom law, or a press law that was introduced and promulgated a month ago. They have an obligation to be certified within a 5-year period. They have to either have graduated from the journalism program at the National University, a 4-year baccalaureate program, or an equivalent at another university somewhere else in the world, or they have to complete this, what is a 2-year night school course in order to maintain their license as journalists. Now, I'm of two minds about this. As somebody who's grown up in a Western tradition, the idea of governments licensing journalists is abhorrent to me. Because if you're allowing a government to license you, you're allowing a government to take your license away. And in effect, you're allowing somebody, a bureaucrat or a politician, to decide whose voices will be heard on the airwaves, whose words will be seen in print. Having said that, and looking at the media landscape in Rwanda, and particularly the history of the media in Rwanda, I can understand very well why the Rwandan government is concerned. During the 1994 genocide, which I covered for the Globe and Mail, one of the things that I didn't fully appreciate until I had actually spent some time on the ground is how poisonous the news media, and I use that term loosely, news media, we wouldn't recognize it as a legitimate kind of journalistic thing, but how poisonous they were in terms of inciting ethnic tensions, and in fact, the radio stations were involved in tactical broadcasts of real-time instructions as to, reading lists of people who were to be killed, instructing people as to where to set up roadblocks, and who to be on the lookout for. So it was a major challenge after the Kagame government won the civil war and ended the genocide. There was a major challenge to kind of rebuild media in Rwanda, and it's taken quite a while now. The undergraduate program at the National University has produced its, well, this year they will have just graduated their second class. But meanwhile, there are hundreds of these other journalists in Rwanda who hope and expect to make a living at it, who have had no formal training. The particular course I was working on was designed to illustrate the difference between news reporting and editorial comment, which is a very kind of fuzzy line in Rwanda. We had a lot of good discussions about what is the difference and what are the obligations of a journalist. We talk a lot about journalism ethics, responsibilities to society, the responsibilities that advocates have and that journalists have. We share to be a voice for the voiceless. We also have had a lot of, unfortunately, good examples of journalism gone sour in Rwanda. Just a couple of weeks ago, a journalist was convicted of blackmail, and he had uncovered information that there was a prominent woman doctor who was having an extramarital affair with a prominent lawyer. The woman went to the police. They set up a sting operation, and they caught the guy red-handed, soliciting a bribe to keep this news out of the paper. Now, I mentioned this to my night school class, and I said, look, this is important, and they all said, well, we know of cases like that. In our own work, people have come and offered us bribes, or we know of other people we've worked with who have done this kind of thing. So there's lots of work to be done. And as I say, I'm really ambivalent about this whole licensing thing. But what we're doing is we're working within the system, trying to raise professional standards. We also, I think, can learn something about the Rwandan experience, because they have kind of reinvented the landscape, or they're in the process of reinventing it. In ways that we have some lessons here. For example, their new press law, as much as I am uncomfortable with the licensing part of it, has an access to information provision in it that has teeth. It says that bureaucrats and government officials have to make known government information to journalists. We have an Access to Information Act here in Canada. It has no teeth. In Rwanda, if you violate the law, you withhold information, you can be heavily fined as a public bureaucrat. There's no penalty here in Canada. So anyway, we can learn a few things, and Stephen Harper, watch out. And, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think most of you have followed what's going on in Zimbabwe will know that the marriage of inconvenience that was forced on Zimbabweans by SADC was truly a shotgun marriage. There was a lot of cautious pessimism and cautious optimism from right across the board. And most of us felt that let's give it a chance. Let's see if it works, because it is something that we all hoped would really work. Some of the shotgun marriages we've seen in this world have worked out very well. In actual practice, when all is said and done, people can fall in love after the event. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite happened the way we thought it might. Soon after the signing of the Global Political Agreement, I don't know why they chose to call it the Global Political Agreement, but I suppose SADC thinks of itself as a global body. There were abductions of civil society activists, of members of the MDC. And despite court orders that really said the government must produce these persons, this didn't happen. Instead of those people being produced or being taken to court if they had in fact committed crimes, we saw more and more abductions. We didn't know where these people were being kept. We didn't know whether they had committed offenses. And in fact, in the majority of cases, because of what had happened to the run-up to the second presidential elections, you know, when people were not found, after a couple of days, the assumption was that people had disappeared without trace and probably wouldn't be found. Thank God most of them have been found, but there are still some that are missing. The persons who had been abducted included very senior personnel in the MDC. Their chief of security was one of them. And it's then called to question whether or not, in fact, both parties were committed to the implementation of the GPA and whether, in fact, this relationship would work. The media also remained being exactly the same. Zimbabwe is a very closed shop when it comes to the media. We only have daily newspapers belonging to the state media. We do not have any independent daily papers. And what goes into the state media is very, very heavily censored. And most of it would qualify as hate speech anywhere else because it targets a whole lot of the civil society activists, members of the MDC, or anybody else who does not quite sing from the same hymn sheet as those who control the state media. Sometimes it does have some hilarious, you know, articles. I have been called very ugly in one of their articles. I have been called very lonely. I don't know how the editor knew all of those things. Certainly, you know, the looks, yes, he's entitled to his opinion. But what has it got to do with what I do? So you can see that there's a lot of abuse in the state media, and most of it is targeted at the opposition people, the persons who were in what was regarded as the opposition. Not much has changed since then in the state media. Not much has changed in the courts. And we have demonstrated this because the minute that the persons who had been abducted were found, and we went to court, there wasn't a single change in the way that the cases were dealt with. The police wouldn't give us access to these persons. The first time we could even speak to them was when they were already in court. When we approached the courts, when we became aware that they were in police custody, when the police had told the courts earlier on that they had no clue where these people are, the courts behaved in exactly the same way they had behaved even before the global political agreement had been signed. Persons who had disappeared, some for months, some for weeks, when we asked the courts to make specific findings that they had been unlawfully abducted, there wasn't a single judge prepared to make that order. When we asked, because most of them had been severely tortured, that they go to hospital, the state lawyers refused that they go to hospital. We did get court orders that said people were entitled to medical attention, but for weeks we failed to get those persons medically examined. And when we finally did get them examined, the judge, incredibly, said, okay, they'll be examined at the maximum security prison in Harare. They will be examined, but whatever the findings, they will not be taken to any medical facility. They must be treated at that maximum prison. We did go with a team of doctors to the maximum prison. It was in the evening. The electricity wasn't working. The area which is supposed to be the ward, the hospital ward, had been closed because it had been turned into a mortuary. There were a lot of dead bodies there. So the doctors had to actually examine these persons using the matron's cell phone light, because that's all there was available there. And for us, it was like, excuse me, we thought there was an agreement signed where everybody's going to work together, and this kind of thing shouldn't actually be happening. And after the examinations, the doctors said all of these persons should be in hospital. It took another few weeks before anybody was actually admitted in hospital. And naturally, for most of us human rights defenders, it was more like, so, what has changed? The abductees were ultimately released through the intervention of the Supreme Court in March, having been in court since December. Everybody quite accepted that really, literally, the case against them just wasn't there. We still haven't had anyone prosecuted, but we did take the one case to the Constitutional Court, basically challenging whether or not somebody who's been abducted, who's been kept incommunicado without basic amenities, who's been tortured, can then suddenly be lawfully in a court of law, and the court doesn't want to find out where they were, what had happened to them, and to bring to book those who were responsible for the abduction. Having gone through all of these courts, and the High Court had failed to once determine that, yes, these were unlawful, we had in the Constitutional Court, for the first time, had the Attorney General, when asked the question, under what law were these people taken from their homes, and the Attorney General's representative considered that there was no law. So do you concede that their captivity from the time that they were taken up to when they suddenly appeared in the custody of the police was unlawful? And the answer was, yes, we concede that. Now, you ask yourself, if things have changed in Zimbabwe, why wasn't a single High Court judge prepared to say on the facts, which are exactly the same, that this is unlawful? There simply isn't a basis on which you should be appearing before us. To us, it meant that really things haven't changed that much. And as I said, this cuts across the board, virtually in every sphere. I speak more about the legal aspect because I can speak more authoritatively there, because that's my area of expertise. But you speak to a journalist, we've had journalists arrested since then. We are currently one of the MDC principals to the agreement is still facing a criminal charge for publishing a piece where he criticized the conduct of the elections. He's a deputy prime minister right now, but he's still facing criminal charges. And nobody has said that those charges shouldn't be there. And as a politician, he's obviously entitled to have commentary on how the elections were held. And it's normal practice anywhere else to allow political players to do that. So, yes, we do have the political agreement, but it hasn't quite brought the kind of freedoms we thought it would bring. Yes, the supermarkets do have food, if you have US dollars or rand, South African rand, but the majority of Zimbabweans don't have that money. Yes, it has reduced the incidence of political violence, which is a good thing, but on the ground, we are not quite seeing what we thought we would see, particularly after the government itself was formed.
that's probably a good note on which to wrap up. So thank you on behalf of all the audience. Thank you to our 3 panelists, and thank you for coming out this afternoon.